Hey everyone, thank you for all the support. In tonight's video brings you 3 more stories that get stranger the longer you sit with them. Sit back, relax, and let's get into it. I work as a land surveyor in northern Georgia, mostly handling boundary disputes and pre-construction surveys for rural properties scattered across 3 counties. It's not a job that usually generates interesting stories. Most of my work involves standing in fields with a GPS unit and a prism pole, confirming corners, checking old deed descriptions against modern measurements, and writing reports that almost nobody reads closely, except lawyers and the occasional angry neighbor disputing a fence line. I was called out to a property near the Tennessee border last spring, a large parcel of mostly wooded land that a family was looking to subdivide and sell off in smaller pieces. The original survey on file was decades old, done with methods that predate GPS entirely, relying on metal pins and reference trees that had mostly grown over or disappeared in the years since. My job was to relocate the original corners as closely as possible and establish new, verifiable boundary lines the family could use for the subdivision paperwork. The property had been in the family for 3 generations, according to the elderly woman who met me at the gate that first morning, a soft-spoken woman named Eleanor, who explained that her grandfather had originally purchased the land sometime in the 1940s. She gave me a folder of old documents, the original survey, some handwritten notes, a few photographs that were too faded to make out clearly. She mentioned almost as an aside while handing over the folder that there was a section toward the back of the property, near the northeast corner, that the family had always avoided clearing or developing, though she didn't offer a reason and I didn't think to ask at the time. I spent the first 2 days working the more accessible parts of the property, confirming corners along the road frontage and the southern boundary where the land bordered a neighbor's cattle pasture. Straightforward work, nothing unusual, the kind of methodical process that fills most of my actual working hours. On the 3rd day, I made my way toward that northeast corner Eleanor had mentioned. The terrain changed noticeably as I got closer, the ground becoming uneven in a way that didn't match the surrounding topography, with small depressions scattered across an area maybe half an acre in size. I've surveyed enough rural land to recognize old foundation remnants and collapsed structures when I see them. But this didn't quite match that pattern either. The depressions were too regular, too evenly spaced, almost like something had been excavated and then deliberately backfilled at some point in the past. I worked through that section methodically, setting up my equipment and taking the measurements I needed, trying not to let my attention wander too much from the actual task. About an hour into that work, my GPS unit started behaving strangely, the signal jumping in ways that didn't match any interference pattern I'd encountered before, even in heavily wooded terrain where signal loss is common. I'd lose lock entirely for several seconds, then regain it with coordinates that placed me dozens of feet from where I actually stood. I assumed equipment malfunction and switched to my backup unit, an older model I kept in the truck for exactly this kind of situation. It behaved normally everywhere else on the property. In that same half-acre section near the northeast corner, it started doing the same thing, losing and regaining signal in a pattern that made no technical sense given the relatively open canopy in that particular clearing. I finished what measurements I could and moved on, planning to return the next day with fresh equipment and hopefully better luck. That evening, back at the small extended stay hotel I was using for the duration of the job, I mentioned the GPS issues to Eleanor when she called to check on my progress, mostly making conversation rather than expecting any real explanation. She went quiet on the phone for a moment, long enough that I asked if she was still there. She told me carefully that her grandfather had used that section of the property as a family burial ground decades earlier, before the family eventually moved to using a proper cemetery in town. She said there had never been formal headstones, just simple wooden markers that had long since rotted away, and that nobody in the current generation knew exactly how many graves were actually out there or precisely where each one was located, since the records from that era were incomplete at best. She asked, somewhat reluctantly, whether I'd noticed anything else unusual out there beyond the equipment trouble. I told her about the depressions in the ground, The irregular pattern that hadn't quite matched what I'd expect from natural erosion or old foundation work. She was quiet again before saying that, matched what she remembered her own mother describing. The rough outlines of where the graves had been dug, visible even decades later if you knew where to look and the light was right. I went back the next morning with the fresh equipment, determined to finish the job despite my growing unease about that particular corner of the property. The GPS behaved normally for the first 20 minutes, long enough that I started to relax and assume the previous day's trouble had simply been a fluke, maybe some atmospheric condition or equipment quirk that had resolved itself overnight. As I approached the actual corner marker, an old iron pin that the original 1940s survey had documented, my equipment started malfunctioning again. The same erratic signal loss, except this time accompanied by something I hadn't experienced the day before. My handheld radio, which I keep for communicating back to my truck when I'm working in areas with poor cell coverage, picked up a brief burst of static followed by what sounded almost like a voice, too distorted and brief to make out any actual words. Gone before I could even be certain I'd heard anything at all rather than imagined it. I stood there for a long moment in that clearing, equipment in hand, surrounded by quiet woods and those irregular depressions in the ground, feeling a kind of unease I genuinely hadn't experienced in 9 years of doing this work, including jobs that had taken me into far more isolated and genuinely dangerous terrain than this gentle Georgia hillside. I finished the measurements as quickly as I could manage, while still maintaining the accuracy my job requires, and I didn't linger in that section any longer than necessary. The final survey I submitted to Eleanor's family marked that northeast corner accurately according to the old deed description, but I made a quiet recommendation in my report that the family consider having the area properly assessed by someone qualified to identify unmarked graves before any subdivision or development moved forward in that section specifically. Eleanor called me a few weeks later to let me know the family had decided to set that particular section aside entirely, excluding it from the subdivision plans and leaving it as undeveloped land in perpetuity. The same decision her grandfather and her mother had apparently made independently across multiple generations, without ever fully explaining why to the family members who came after them. I've surveyed a lot of properties since that job, plenty of them with their own old stories and unmarked history scattered across rural Georgia. None of them have stayed with me quite the way that half-acre clearing has. The irregular ground, the equipment that wouldn't behave properly, and that single burst of something on my radio that I've never been able to fully convince myself was nothing. I worked as a contractor doing pipeline right-of-way inspections across rural West Virginia for about 3 years, a job that mostly involved driving or hiking long stretches of cleared land that natural gas companies maintain along their buried pipeline routes. The work itself is solitary by nature. You're checking for erosion, encroachment, signs of leaks or damage, walking miles of cleared corridor that cuts through forest, farmland, in the occasional backyard, usually without seeing another person for the entire shift. The pipeline I covered most regularly ran through a stretch of dense Appalachian forest in the southern part of the state, terrain steep enough in places that the right-of-way had to switch back up ridge lines rather than running in a straight line the way it would across flatter ground. Most of my route was accessible by a company-issued side-by-side vehicle, but certain sections, particularly where the terrain got too steep or the ground too soft for the vehicle, required hiking in on foot with my inspection equipment in a backpack. I'd been doing this particular route for about a year and a half when I first started noticing something strange about one specific section, a stretch of right-of-way that crossed through a hollow between two ridges, an area the older guys at the company office referred to simply as the low crossing, without much elaboration beyond that name. I'd asked about it once during training, mostly out of curiosity about the casual way everyone seemed to avoid discussing it directly, and gotten only a vague answer about the terrain being difficult and the company having had some unspecified trouble with that section in years past. My first genuinely strange experience there happened on a fall afternoon, overcast and cool, the kind of weather that made the dense tree cover feel even darker than usual, as I hiked down into that hollow to check a section of exposed pipe casing that had been flagged in a previous report. I was maybe 20 minutes into that particular stretch, moving carefully down the slope with my equipment bag, when I became aware of a sound that didn't match anything I'd expect from the forest around me. It was a kind of rhythmic tapping, metal on metal, coming from somewhere ahead of me along the corridor, roughly in the direction of the exposed casing I was heading to inspect. My first assumption was that another contractor was already working in that section, maybe someone from a different crew handling a repair I hadn't been informed about, though that would have been unusual given how carefully these companies typically coordinate to avoid exactly that kind of overlap. I called out as I approached, identifying myself the way you're trained to do when approaching another worker on a job site, partly out of courtesy and partly because surprising someone working with tools in isolated terrain isn't a great idea for anyone's safety. No response came back, though the tapping continued steadily as I got closer. When I reached the actual section of exposed casing, there was no one there. No tools, no vehicle, no sign that anyone had been working in that area recently at all. The tapping sound, which had seemed to be coming from almost exactly that location moments before, had stopped entirely, leaving only the ordinary ambient sounds of wind moving through the trees on either side of the cleared corridor. I stood there for a while, scanning the surrounding tree line, genuinely confused rather than alarmed at that point, still operating under the assumption that there was some mundane explanation I simply hadn't identified yet. Sound travels strangely in terrain like that, bouncing off ridge lines and traveling along cleared corridors in ways that can make a distant noise seem much closer than it actually is. I finished my inspection of the casing, found nothing unusual structurally, and continued on with the rest of my route for that day without further incident. I mentioned the tapping sound that evening to my supervisor, a guy named Dale who'd worked for the pipeline company for almost 2 decades, and who I'd developed a decent rapport with over my time there. He didn't dismiss it the way I expected him to. Instead, he asked specifically whether it had happened in the low crossing section, and when I confirmed it had, he got quiet in a way that made me genuinely curious rather than simply making conversation. He eventually told me that section of right-of-way had been the site of a serious accident decades earlier, before his own time with the company, but still discussed occasionally among the older crews, involving a worker who'd been killed during original pipeline construction when a section of equipment malfunctioned, the kind of industrial accident that happens rarely but does happen in work this physically demanding and remote. He said other inspectors over the years had reported similar experiences in that exact section, sounds that resembled tool work or construction activity with no corresponding crew or equipment actually present to explain it. I returned to that section several more times over the following months, partly because my route required it regularly, and partly, I'll admit, because some part of me wanted to understand what I'd actually experienced rather than simply avoiding it. Most of those return visits passed without incident, ordinary inspection work in a quiet, isolated stretch of forest. The second notable experience happened the following spring, during a routine inspection after a period of heavy rain had raised concerns about erosion along several sections of the corridor. I was checking the low crossing specifically because the increased water flow through that hollow made it a priority area for that particular round of inspections. The terrain was muddier than usual, slowing my progress considerably as I made my way down into the hollow, my boots sinking several inches into softened ground with nearly every step. About halfway through that section, I noticed something in the mud that stopped me completely. A set of footprints running perpendicular to the cleared corridor, crossing from one tree line to the other, the kind of clear, fresh impression that fresh mud captures perfectly. What stopped me wasn't the footprints themselves, which could have easily belonged to a hunter or hiker who'd wandered through the area, technically private but not heavily restricted in that particular section. What stopped me was that the prints simply ended partway across the open corridor, with no corresponding prints continuing onward toward the opposite tree line, as though whoever made them had simply stopped existing partway through their walk across that open ground. I photographed the prints for my own records, more out of unsettled curiosity than any actual professional requirement, and continued my inspection work that day more cautiously than usual, finishing as efficiently as I could manage and leaving that section before the light started fading in the late afternoon. I asked Dale about it again that evening, showing him the photo I'd taken. He studied it for a long moment before telling me, somewhat reluctantly, that he'd heard similar descriptions from other inspectors over the years. Footprints that appeared without explanation and then simply stopped, always in that same general section of the route. He didn't offer any theory beyond what he'd already told me about the accident decades earlier, and I got the sense he genuinely didn't have one. That this was simply one of those persistent oddities the company's long-term employees had collectively decided to accept without fully understanding. I continued working that route for another year and a half before eventually transitioning to a different position within the company that kept me primarily in the office rather than out doing fieldwork directly. I never had another experience in that hollow as strange as the footprints that ended mid-stride, though I'll admit I never fully relaxed during the inspections I continued doing there in the meantime. Always more alert in that specific stretch than the actual difficulty of the terrain alone would have justified. I think about that section of forest sometimes, the rhythmic tapping that matched no visible source, the footprints that simply stopped as though something had been lifted away mid-step. West Virginia has a lot of remote, difficult terrain with its own quiet history scattered throughout it, places where hard, dangerous work has occasionally gone wrong over the decades in ways that don't always get fully explained or resolved. I've come to think that Hollow is simply one of those places, holding on to something from its own history that the rest of us are only allowed to glimpse occasionally, never quite enough to fully understand. I worked the overnight stocking shift at a large retail store outside Phoenix for almost 2 years during my early 20s, the kind of job that pays decently for unskilled labor, specifically because almost nobody wants to work through the night restocking shelves while the store sits closed to customers. The hours were rough, 10 at night until 6 in the morning, but the pay differential made it worth it for someone my age without a lot of other obligations pulling at my schedule. The store itself was enormous, one of those big box locations with aisles that stretched the length of a football field. Automotive on one end, groceries on the other, everything in between organized into the kind of sprawling layout that takes new employees weeks to fully memorize. During the day, it was a normal, bustling retail environment, but at night, with the lights dimmed to the reduced overnight setting and customers locked out entirely, it became something else, vast and quiet in a way that took some getting used to. Our overnight crew was small, usually 6 or 7 people scattered across different departments, restocking shelves from pallets delivered the previous evening, running floor buffers, handling the kind of maintenance work that simply can't happen while customers are present. We worked mostly independently, each person assigned a section, communicating through radio if we needed help or had a question, otherwise alone with our individual carts and pallets for most of the shift. I'd been working there about 8 months when I first started noticing something odd about the seasonal aisle, the section near the back of the store that rotated stock depending on the time of year, holiday decorations, garden supplies, school supplies, whatever the calendar called for. That particular section had a reputation among the overnight crew that I picked up on gradually. The way you absorb workplace folklore over time without anyone sitting you down to explain it directly. People avoided working that aisle alone if they could help it, finding reasons to ask a coworker to handle that section's restocking or trading tasks during the assignment rotation each shift began with. Nobody gave me a clear explanation when I asked early on. Just vague comments about the lighting being bad back there, or the motion sensors for the overnight lighting system being unreliable in that particular corner of the store. I didn't think much of it until a night in October when seasonal had transitioned to Halloween merchandise, and I drew the short straw on the assignment rotation, ending up responsible for restocking that exact aisle for the first time since I'd started. The work itself was unremarkable for the first hour, breaking down pallets of decorations and stocking shelves according to the planogram taped to the end of the aisle. The store's overnight lighting in that section did seem dimmer than other areas, something I noticed but didn't think much about, assuming it was simply an older fixture that hadn't been updated during whatever renovation had modernized the rest of the lighting system. About 90 minutes into my shift, working alone in that aisle with my radio clipped to my belt in case I needed anything, I heard what sounded like someone moving in the adjacent aisle, the footsteps and slight rustling sounds you'd expect from another employee restocking nearby. I didn't think anything of it initially, assuming a coworker had been assigned the neighboring section. I called out a casual greeting, the kind of thing you do automatically when you think you recognize a coworker's presence nearby. No response came back. I finished the box I was working on and stepped to the end of the aisle to glance down the neighboring row, expecting to see whoever I'd heard. The aisle was empty, completely empty, stretching the full length of the store, with the dim overnight lighting reaching all the way to the far wall. No cart, no person, nothing that would explain the sounds I'd clearly heard moments before. I checked my radio, thinking maybe someone had called for me, and I'd misheard it as movement nearby. Nothing on the channel beyond the usual quiet static. I went back to my own aisle, slightly more alert than before, but still mostly convinced I'd simply misjudged the source of some ordinary sound. Maybe the building's settling or an HVAC system cycling somewhere overhead. The footsteps returned about 20 minutes later, closer this time, seemingly originating from the same aisle I was actually working in, rather than the one beside it. I stopped what I was doing and listened carefully. Slow, deliberate steps, moving along the aisle from the far end toward where I stood, pausing periodically the way someone might pause to examine merchandise on the shelves while walking. I called out again, more firmly this time, asking directly if someone was there. The footsteps stopped entirely. I stood there in that dim aisle for what felt like a very long time, surrounded by rows of Halloween decorations, listening to nothing but the building's ordinary ambient hum. Eventually, I convinced myself to continue working, though I found myself checking over my shoulder far more often than the job actually required for the remainder of that section. When I mentioned the experience to a coworker named Marcus during our break that night, he didn't seem surprised at all. He told me that aisle had a reputation going back further than either of our employment there. Something about a former employee who had died unexpectedly years earlier, collapsing in that exact section during an overnight shift, from what management had described at the time as a sudden medical issue. He said the details had never been entirely clear to the staff who'd been around at the time, and that the company had handled the situation quietly, but that overnight footsteps and unexplained sounds in that aisle had been reported by enough different employees over the years that it had become an accepted, if unofficial, piece of the store's overnight culture. I worked at that store for another year after that incident, and I made a point of trading assignments whenever that aisle came up in the rotation, same as everyone else apparently had been quietly doing long before I ever started. I never heard the footsteps again after that one night, though I also never fully relaxed in that section whenever I did occasionally end up working near it. I eventually left that job for a position with better hours, and I haven't thought about it much in the years since, except on the rare occasion I find myself walking through a similar big box store late in the evening, the overnight crew already starting their shift as customers filter out. And I remember exactly how that quiet, half-lit version of a familiar space can feel entirely different from the place you know during the day.